Imagine sitting down to a sumptuous dinner in 1879 Hampton, golden pies, steaming roasts, fragrant stews, each bite more delicious than the last. Imagine the woman who served you, Lucy, smiling softly as she poured your wine, seeming the very picture of devotion and care. Now imagine the horror, the unspeakable betrayal. For 5 long months, every morsel you savored, every decadent dish you praised, was not ordinary food at all, but the flesh of human beings. Lucy, an enslaved woman forced to endure unimaginable cruelty, had turned the bodies of the very slaves her masters tormented and killed into meals, not for pleasure, but as her quiet, dark revenge. She fed the 12 elite gentlemen the horror they thought they buried forever, day after day, without a single one ever suspecting the truth. I want you to picture this: the world around Lucy unaware, or worse, indifferent, while she moved through hallways lined with portraits of the powerful, faces frozen in eternal approval of a society built on secrets. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, a place for those willing to witness history's darkest corners. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows? Subscribe now and comment your location to join this investigation, because Lucy's story isn't just history. It's a haunting, a moral reckoning, and an invitation to see what most dare not. Hampton, a sprawling estate deep in the antebellum South, was the epitome of grandeur and cultivated elegance, yet its beauty was a mask, a veneer concealing unspeakable cruelty. Imagine stepping onto the perfectly raked gardens where roses and magnolias flourished under meticulous care, their scent heavy in the humid air, while behind the walls of the mansion, another, far darker world thrived. The polished silver gleamed under candlelight in vast dining halls, and the crystal chandeliers scattered prisms across the ceilings. Yet these splendors masked the sinister orchestration of power and suffering that maintained the household's facade. The rhythmic clip-clop of horses on cobblestone paths, the rustle of silk gowns, the polite laughter of affluent guests, all of it was a carefully maintained symphony designed to obscure the oppressive heartbeat coursing through the estate. Now, you have to understand, slavery dictated the unyielding law of survival here. Every action, every glance, every gesture by those enslaved was scrutinized, controlled, and punished if found lacking. Lucy's world was defined by invisible chains, by whispered threats, and the ever-present weight of fear pressing against her shoulders. The coppery tang of blood from the kitchen, the chilling early morning air that seeped through cracks in the servants' quarters, the acrid smoke of burning wood for cooking, these details were the theater of her daily terror, and every moment carried the tension of survival. Hampton was more than a house. It was a machine for control, a labyrinth where beauty and horror coexisted, and Lucy's reality was a constant negotiation with the shadows that moved silently behind gilded walls. The masters of Hampton presented themselves as paragons of civility, the very image of Southern gentility. On paper, their reputations were impeccable, men of influence respected by neighbors, celebrated in local newspapers, and welcomed at social gatherings with smiles and handshakes. You could see them in their tailored coats, their polished boots catching the sunlight as they strolled across manicured lawns, a picture of control and authority. But beneath that impeccable surface, a far darker truth lurked. Now, you have to understand, their civility was a carefully constructed mask. The darkness revealed itself in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. A cruel jest over wine that left the servants uneasy. The lingering gaze of ownership that pinned Lucy like a bird in a cage. A command barked in passing without a trace of empathy. These were not the acts of overt brutality, but of insidious manipulation, the quiet assertion of dominance that left no one untouched. Lucy, attuned to the rhythms of fear and submission, could sense the unspoken threats that underpinned every polite interaction. This duplicity, the contrast between public honor and private cruelty, made them all the more terrifying. Their power was not wielded through brute force alone, but through a system of control that normalized horror, rendering the unthinkable routine and the monstrous invisible to outsiders. The masters of Hampton were architects of terror in fine suits, and every interaction Lucy endured carried the weight of unspoken consequences, shaping a world where survival required not just obedience, but a constant reading of shadows and whispers. To the outside world, Hampton was a model of refinement and prosperity. Officially, the estate flourished through its generosity, its reputation for culinary excellence, and the seamless, polite service of its staff. Lucy, as the head cook, was lauded as a genius of the kitchen. Her talent for transforming raw ingredients into spectacular feasts was spoken of with admiration, her dedication to the household's comfort framed as unwavering loyalty. Now you have to understand, any irregularities were easily smoothed over. A spoiled cut of meat, a delayed dinner service, or a minor error in seasoning could be blamed on human fallibility, the kind that occurred in every bustling household, and thus suspicion rarely lingered. Guests, arriving in their silk gowns and polished shoes, were presented with flawless, elaborate meals that appeared to materialize effortlessly, never glimpsing the strain behind the preparation or the terror that guided Lucy's every move. She moved through the kitchen with precision, her hand steady, her expression composed, as if the horrors she endured existed in a parallel world. Yet every dish, every simmering pot, carried the weight of moral compromise and psychological torment that no outsider could perceive. The explanations were comforting illusions, expertly designed to maintain the estate's reputation while concealing the impossible reality lurking beneath the surface. This carefully constructed cover story transformed Lucy into a paradox, a celebrated figure whose brilliance masked unimaginable suffering and whose very skill became both a shield and a cage. Hampton's perfection, polished and enviable, hid the grotesque truths simmering quietly behind gleaming countertops and the rhythmic chopping of knives. Beneath the polished floors and gilded halls of Hampton, a hidden machinery of secrecy and compliance pulsed quietly, invisible to the untrained eye. The kitchens and pantries, which outwardly appeared as centers of culinary excellence, were actually labyrinths of concealment, designed to ensure that Lucy's horrifying task remained unseen. Locked cupboards with false bottoms, hidden compartments behind shelving, and discreet waste disposal methods turned ordinary meal preparation into a clandestine operation. Every step was choreographed to perfection. Deliveries were timed to avoid curious eyes, scraps and leftovers vanished without a trace, and a network of silent accomplices, fellow servants coerced into obedience, acted as unspoken guardians of the secret. Now, you have to understand, these mechanisms were never overt. They were integrated seamlessly into the daily rhythm of the estate. A guest might admire a gleaming kitchen without ever suspecting the shadowed corners where terror took root. Every detail, from the ticking of clocks dictating Lucy's schedule to the hushed whispers ensuring no secret slipped through, was meticulously managed. Even the architecture of the mansion aided in concealment. Narrow service corridors, hidden stairwells, and soundproofed storage rooms became conduits for secrecy. The estate was not merely a house. It was a theater of deception, a stage where appearances and reality diverged sharply, and where the orchestration of horror could continue uninterrupted. Within this framework, Lucy moved like a silent actor in a play scripted by fear, her every action guided by a system designed to protect the powerful while imprisoning the unwilling. Hampton's beauty concealed a dark precision that kept its unspeakable truths securely behind closed doors. Hampton, for all its grandeur, was not immune to curious observations. Neighbors, visiting dignitaries, and even casual guests occasionally noticed subtle oddities, a faint, metallic scent lingering in the hallways long after the kitchen fires had been extinguished, slight inconsistencies in the menu that left some courses missing or delayed, and whispers of food shortages that never seemed to have a clear explanation. Now, you have to understand, these anomalies were never allowed to linger. Each one was promptly accounted for with explanations that were both plausible and unassailable. The peculiar smells, just the aftermath of overcooked meats or the earthy aroma of a new batch of bread cooling in the pantries, missing dishes or delayed service, the unpredictable nature of a bustling kitchen, and the occasional human error, rumors of scarcity, the whimsical demands of masters known for their eccentricities, Even local authorities, when approached with questions or murmurs, were unconcerned, convinced that any suggestion of misconduct could safely be dismissed as idle gossip, misinterpretation, or the flights of an overactive imagination. This carefully cultivated veneer of rationality and civility acted as a shield, insulating the estate from scrutiny. It allowed Hampton's horrifying secrets to remain not just hidden, but virtually invisible, buried beneath layers of social respectability, polite reassurances, and bureaucratic oversight. To the outside observer, the estate was flawless, orderly, and morally upright. Yet beneath that polished facade, terror continued in the shadows, unnoticed and unchallenged, leaving Lucy to navigate a world where any deviation from silence could risk discovery and certain punishment. Hampton's respectability was its armor, concealing a darkness that no one was allowed, or perhaps brave enough, to acknowledge. Lucy was far from alone in the grim reality she endured, though her allies were few and often unwilling. Within the estate, certain insiders, fellow servants, kitchen staff, and even junior stewards played crucial roles in the concealment of the horrors unfolding under the polished veneer of Hampton. Now, you have to understand, their participation was not driven by malice. It was a complex web of fear, self-interest, and the harsh imperatives of obedience to an unyielding social hierarchy. Some ensured that the necessary supplies arrived without attracting suspicion, discreetly moving crates and barrels at odd hours. Others cleared away anything that might hint at irregularities. Dishes, scraps, tools, erasing evidence before curious eyes could detect it. Even simple acts, like a nod of acknowledgement in a dim corridor or a fleeting glance exchanged during hurried service, reinforced the understanding that secrecy was mandatory, survival-dependent, and absolute. This complicity created a suffocating environment for Lucy. Every step she took was guided not only by the demands of her masters, but also by the silent cooperation of those who, like her, were trapped in a system where defiance could mean ruin. Every whispered instruction, every careful avoidance of conversation became a constant reminder that in this world, silence was both shield and weapon. Lucy's few allies, bound by fear and hierarchy, could not offer genuine protection, leaving her isolated with a knowledge that weighed heavier than any chains. In a mansion built on appearances, even the human connections meant to help her were entangled in the machinery of deception, further tightening the invisible grip of control over her life. The victims of Hampton's hidden horrors were far from faceless. They were individuals with stories, families, and quiet dreams, all brutally interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. Now you have to understand, each one carried the weight of vulnerability that the estate's hierarchy ruthlessly exploited. Some were enslaved like Lucy, bound to service under the constant threat of punishment, forced into compliance simply to survive another day. Others were powerless in their own ways, men, women, or even children whose presence in the household intersected with the darker machinations of the masters, rendering them pawns in a game of domination and secrecy. The vulnerability of these individuals was weaponized, twisted into a mechanism that reinforced fear and ensured obedience. Every life affected, every whispered fear and silenced scream left an indelible mark, etching a trail of moral decay and complicity through the mansion. Lucy's own burden was compounded by this knowledge. Every dish she prepared, every meal she served, carried with it the shadows of those whose suffering she bore witness to, whose humanity was violated even as the world outside dined obliviously. Their presence was a haunting reminder of the stakes, a living measure of the moral abyss in which the household functioned, and a constant, silent testament to the ethical compromises forced upon those trapped in the machinery of cruelty. The victims' stories, though often invisible to outsiders, resonated in every corner of the kitchen, every whispered exchange, and every sleepless night, shaping the horror, guilt, and reluctant complicity that Lucy carried like a shadow she could never escape. Even in a mansion built on secrecy and discipline, there were those who stumbled upon truths meant to remain hidden, accidental witnesses whose curiosity or misfortune brought them perilously close to the darkness behind Hampton's polished walls. Imagine, if you will, a wandering servant pausing near the edge of the kitchen, a child drawn to a flickering shadow, or a guest whose eyes lingered too long on the quiet corners where the ordinary met the unspeakable. One such witness caught fragments of a reality so horrifying that it could scarcely be named. A hand trembling over a dish, a hushed exchange of words, the barely perceptible tension in the air. They perceived what others either ignored or rationalized away. The realization was immediate and perilous. Knowledge itself became a weapon, one as dangerous as any tool or threat wielded by the masters. Every glance, every footstep, every sound, the clatter of utensils, the hiss of the fire, was transformed into a potential signal of exposure. The mansion's rhythm, once familiar and ordered, became a gauntlet of tension where the witness had to navigate fear and subterfuge with extraordinary cunning. Survival depended on reading the subtle cues of those in power, on anticipating moments when curiosity could betray life itself. Lucy, already bound by her own terrifying obligations, now carried the invisible weight of this witness's peril. Their presence, even fleeting, injected a new layer of risk into an already suffocating environment. Every shadow became a test of nerve, every whispered sound a potential harbinger of doom, and the precarious balance between secrecy and survival hung by the thinnest of threads. The moment the accidental witness realized what they had seen, a cold dread settled into their chest like a stone. Every detail replayed relentlessly in their mind. The hushed chopping, the metallic tang of blood in the air, the way Lucy's hands trembled while obeying orders she never wished to follow. Sleep became impossible. Dreams were haunted by grotesque images they could neither erase nor share. When the witness attempted to speak, to warn others, their words were met with disbelief, laughter, or thinly veiled hostility. "You must be imagining things," friends said. Surely no one could do that, authorities insisted. Their desperation to be heard only amplified the isolation, turning a simple act of seeing into a tormenting prison of conscience. And yet, despite the dismissal, the witness could not forget, nor forgive themselves for the small, powerless role they played as a bystander in a nightmare too vast to confront alone. Every encounter with Lucy afterward was tinged with terror and empathy. Each glance at the bustling estate, a reminder that the world outside remained ignorant of the horrors contained within. The psychological cost was profound. Anxiety clawed at their stomach, paranoia shadowed every hallway, and the haunting certainty of complicity, whether direct or indirect, gnawed endlessly at their sense of morality. In that silence of disbelief, the estate thrived, unconcerned and oblivious, while the witness's mind became a crucible of terror, memory, and guilt. It was a cruel paradox. Knowledge granted no power, only suffering. They had seen the truth, yet the world insisted on ignorance. And so, the story continued in quiet, invisible corridors, shaping lives and decisions in ways no official inquiry would ever acknowledge, leaving the witness to bear alone a burden that society refused to recognize. When whispers of strange occurrences finally reached the ears of local authorities, a formal inquiry was convened, but it was a performance rather than a pursuit of truth. Investigators arrived with notebooks and polite smiles, carefully listening while suppressing disbelief. Yet their questions were shallow, rehearsed, designed to extract nothing that might disrupt the veneer of respectability. A misunderstanding, they declared. Rumors blown out of proportion, they repeated to each new witness. Every stone turned was meticulously preempted by masters who guided the narrative, and documents were conveniently lost or misplaced. The machinery of justice, in this case, operated with elegant precision to fail. Officials feigned concern while ensuring that no true scrutiny would reach the heart of Hampton. Lucy, invisible behind the glimmering silver and polished floors, remained unseen and unconsidered. Her coerced complicity remained a secret, shielded by social hierarchies and institutional inertia. Now you have to understand, the investigation wasn't merely incompetent, it was complicit. By constructing a facade of due diligence, the authorities reassured the public and themselves, leaving the estate's horrors unchallenged. Even the accidental witness, trembling with fear and the burden of knowledge, found their testimony dismissed as fantasy, imagination, or hysteria. And yet, the careful choreography of denial only heightened the tension, creating a perfect storm where evil could continue in plain sight. It was a stark reminder that systems meant to protect often serve to preserve power, and that those who sought truth were left to navigate the shadows alone, facing threats both overt and insidious. While society nodded and pretended all was well, the survivors of Hampton's hidden horrors carried the marks of their ordeal like unreadable manuscripts etched onto their very beings. Faces once bright with laughter were now hollowed, eyes darting with suspicion and fear, as if each shadow might conceal another unspeakable demand. Their bodies, emaciated or scarred, betrayed the physical toll of servitude intertwined with the unimaginable acts forced upon them. Every movement, every hesitant gesture told a story that no official record dared to document. You have to understand, these were not merely victims. They were living evidence of a crime so deeply buried that its reality seemed almost mythic. Lucy herself, though the unwilling architect of the estate's macabre dinners, bore a haunted gaze that betrayed the dual weight of survival and complicity. She moved through the halls like a ghost, hands shaking, voice low, constantly aware that a single misstep could draw suspicion or punishment. Even the other servants, who had witnessed pieces of the unspeakable acts, carried quiet tremors in their demeanor, their laughter forced, their smiles brittle. The mansion itself seemed complicit, absorbing and reflecting their trauma. The polished floors echoing footsteps that no longer felt safe, the kitchens smelling faintly of the iron tang of past horrors, and the walls whispering secrets the world refused to hear. To look at them was to confront a paradox. The human body's remarkable resilience juxtaposed with the psychological fractures that lingered far beyond the immediate suffering. And yet, society remained blind. Visitors admired the estate's elegance, oblivious to the silent witnesses walking among them. Each survivor was a walking testimony, a living reminder of horrors meticulously concealed, their altered selves silently demanding recognition, understanding, and justice, even when the world refused to acknowledge the truth. Beneath the polished kitchens and polite dining rooms of Hampton lay a system so meticulously organized it could have been mistaken for a laboratory. The process was calculated with clinical precision, every step designed to conceal, normalize, and perpetuate the unspeakable. Lucy, trained as a cook but trapped in a nightmare of coercion, followed exacting instructions that reduced human life to ingredients in a grimly efficient routine. There were schedules, cleaning protocols, even methods to mask taste and texture, an appalling fusion of culinary skill and moral corruption. Notes hidden in ledgers, coded in innocuous language, detailed portions, timings, and rotations, ensuring each master remained oblivious while the horror continued unchecked. Now you have to understand, this was not mere improvisation. It was systematized. Every act was performed under supervision or threat, with punishments for deviation carefully outlined yet rarely enforced. Fear alone sufficed. Even the disposal of evidence followed ritualistic care. Ash from fires, discarded scraps, careful laundering of linens, all calculated to maintain the illusion of domestic normalcy. Investigators, had they looked closer, might have traced patterns invisible to the untrained eye, patterns revealing a logic that was both horrifying and methodical. Yet the genius of the system was its invisibility, its ability to transform horror into routine, terror into mundane obligation. Victims became components, processes perfected, and compliance was enforced through psychological mastery as much as through chains. This is where the story gets truly chilling. The human mind's adaptability, the sinister ingenuity of those in power, and the survival instincts of the coerced intersected to produce a theater of calculated atrocity that would leave the unprepared observer reeling. To witness it, even in hindsight, is to confront the cold, methodical reality behind what society would rather dismiss as legend. Amid the shadows of Hampton, a figure emerged whose determination would pierce the veil of secrecy, a truth seeker both relentless and flawed, not a detective by trade, nor a crusader by choice. This hero was driven by personal stakes, a sibling who had vanished under mysterious circumstances at the estate, leaving a void filled with fear and unanswered questions. Their past was complicated, riddled with mistakes and regrets that made them question every judgment, every instinct. But these imperfections were precisely what fueled their dogged pursuit. They moved with caution, aware that a single misstep could unravel everything, yet their curiosity and moral urgency refused to allow complacency. I want you to picture this. A person standing at the threshold of a mansion that seemed benign to outsiders, yet pulsed with hidden horrors, the very air thick with whispered secrets. The faint metallic scent of blood, almost imperceptible but unmistakably present to the attuned senses. This hero was not invincible. Their courage was tinged with doubt, their steps careful yet haunted by the knowledge of what could go wrong. And yet, the fire within them burned brighter with each suppressed confession, each rumor dismissed by society. They began piecing together fragments, offhand remarks, fleeting glances, subtle inconsistencies that the world overlooked. Every discovery deepened both the horror and the resolve, forcing them to navigate a labyrinth of fear, manipulation, and human depravity. Let's be real. The journey ahead would test not just their intellect or bravery, but the very limits of their empathy, morality, and endurance. They were stepping into a darkness meticulously engineered to remain hidden, yet within that darkness, the first sparks of exposure, justice, and reckoning were beginning to form. Our hero knew that standing outside the estate and speculating would achieve nothing. To uncover the truth, they had to step inside, to infiltrate the very system that perpetuated horror. With a forged recommendation and the careful mask of humility, they secured a position in the kitchens, walking the same halls as Lucy and the other coerced servants. Every gesture was measured, every question carefully phrased, for the smallest misstep could invite suspicion or worse. I want you to picture this: the clatter of pots and knives masking whispered instructions, the smell of simmering food mingling with something darker, a tension that pressed against the skin like a physical weight. The hero observed patterns, noting the timing of meals, the subtle signals among servants, the quiet compliance that veiled terror. They began forming a mental map of the estate's hidden operations, storage areas, secret compartments, coded ledgers, every detail a piece of a puzzle that society would never willingly acknowledge. Interactions with Lucy were particularly fraught. Her gaze, haunted yet defiant, suggested both trust and caution, a silent communication that could be deciphered only by someone willing to endure the emotional burden. Now, you have to understand, infiltrating such a meticulously controlled environment demanded constant vigilance. The hero's every sense was engaged, every instinct sharpened to detect deception, coercion, or betrayal. And yet, amidst the fear and tension, a grudging empathy grew for those forced into unimaginable compliance, reinforcing the stakes of the investigation. With each passing day, the hero collected fragments of proof, subtle admissions, and glimpses of the methodology that had so far evaded scrutiny. This was not mere observation, it was immersion, a dangerous dance on the knife edge of discovery and exposure, where one misstep could collapse the fragile balance between survival and revelation. Now I want you to pause and really consider what's happening here. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. Up to this point, we've glimpsed the mechanisms of fear, the silent complicity, and the shadows in which Lucy and the other servants operated. But our hero is about to uncover truths that the estate's polished walls were never meant to reveal. I need you to picture yourself standing in those kitchens, the metallic tang of something unthinkable in the air, the quiet tension pressing down like a living thing, while secrets whispered just out of reach. Imagine witnessing the calculated cruelty, understanding the meticulous methods, yet feeling utterly powerless to intervene. And this is exactly why we dig deeper, why we question the stories we're told, why we look beyond appearances. If you've ever felt the pull of hidden truths, the urgency to confront what others ignore, then lean in closer, because what comes next will challenge not only your sense of morality, but the very way you perceive human endurance and culpability. The moment of undeniable truth arrived quietly, almost deceptively so. Our hero, moving deeper into the estate's hidden corridors, stumbled upon a locked pantry that everyone had assumed contained nothing more than preserved foods and spices. But the air was thick with a faint, metallic tang, and the faintest stain on the worn floorboards hinted at horrors concealed for months. With trembling hands, they pried open the door, revealing jars meticulously labeled, some with innocuous names, others cryptically coded, each containing fragments that made the stomach churn, a calculated archive of human flesh processed and stored, awaiting service to the 12 masters. Ledger books lay stacked on a shelf above, filled with precise entries, dates, portions, rotations, even dietary preferences, exposing the horrifying precision with which Lucy had been coerced to comply. I want you to picture this. The hero's heart hammering, eyes darting between the jars and the ledgers, each discovery a new thread, unraveling the sinister tapestry. Evidence that had been invisible to the casual observer now screamed in stark, irrefutable clarity. No longer whispers, no longer shadows. This was the ledger of atrocities, the blueprint of a moral abyss disguised as domestic routine. Even the hero's breath seemed heavy in the silent pantry, their mind grappling with both revulsion and the urgent need to preserve the proof. This was not discovery for spectacle. It was survival, the first step toward exposing a nightmare that had thrived in secrecy. Every detail documented here would form the cornerstone of revelation, the hard evidence that would make the invisible visible and the unthinkable undeniable. The moment our hero realized the full scope of what they had uncovered, time became both ally and enemy. Every creak of the wooden floors, every whisper of movement in the halls felt magnified, signaling that discovery had shifted from silent observation to imminent danger. I want you to picture this. The hero clutching the incriminating ledgers, their pulse racing, heart hammering like a drum in the suffocating quiet. As the shadows seemed to pulse with the awareness of pursuit, they moved swiftly, yet carefully, tracing the same pathways that had previously seemed safe, now transformed into a labyrinth of potential betrayal. A door slammed behind them, a warning or a trap, they couldn't tell, forcing them to break into a desperate sprint through the estate's corridors, the metallic scent of terror hanging thick in the air. Outside, the grounds that once seemed expansive and benign now twisted into a maze of hedges, carriage paths, and hidden alcoves. Figures emerged, perhaps servants loyal to the masters or enforcers of secrecy, their footsteps quickening, voices hushed yet urgent. The hero ducked, hid, and darted, senses sharpened to every sound, every movement, feeling the weight of both the evidence and the consequences of being caught. And yet, with every near miss, the hero's resolve hardened. This evidence had to survive. Each heartbeat, each calculated risk, each breath stolen in the darkness carried them closer to freedom. Let's be real, escaping wasn't just about running. It was about outwitting, outlasting, and outmaneuvering a system designed to suppress truth, to keep horrors hidden behind polished facades. Finally, the hero emerged from the suffocating grip of the estate, stepping onto the familiar roads that led to town, but the sense of relief was fleeting. I want you to picture this. The sun low on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like the secrets still clinging to the ledgers in the hero's hands. Every passerby appeared oblivious, absorbed in mundane concerns, while the weight of what they carried was nothing short of apocalyptic. They rushed to authorities and trusted allies, expecting immediate shock, swift action, and validation of the horrors documented within those meticulous ledgers. But here's where the story takes a bitter turn. Disbelief and denial greeted them. Eyes narrowed, brows furrowed, and polite skepticism masked the unspoken notion that some truths were too grotesque, too inconvenient to be acknowledged. Can you imagine holding evidence of unimaginable atrocities and being met with cautionary dismissals, hints of bureaucracy, and the polite refrains of, "Are you certain?" The hero, exhausted and shaken, felt the gravity of isolation, the crushing realization that survival alone would not ensure justice. Yet, even amidst frustration, determination ignited anew. They understood that the ledgers were more than proof. They were a lifeline to truth, a challenge to societal apathy. Each step forward required both courage and cunning, navigating a world that preferred comfortable illusions over harsh reality. Now, the hero faced a paradox. Civilization promised safety, yet within its institutions lurked the same forces that had allowed atrocities to flourish. And so, the reversal was complete, victory and survival. But the struggle to compel belief had only just begun. The authorities finally mobilized, though not without hesitation, skepticism, and whispered doubts. I want you to picture the scene. The estate at dawn, shrouded in mist, every shuttered window and hidden doorway, a potential tomb for secrets long concealed. Our hero led the way, the weight of the ledgers pressing against their chest, as if the truth itself demanded to be carried with reverence. When the doors were forced open, what awaited was beyond comprehension. A meticulously arranged chamber where every element of horror had been documented, preserved, and normalized. Shelves of jars, precisely labeled and lined like trophies, contained evidence of acts too grotesque to fully absorb in a single glance. I want you to imagine the metallic tang in the air, the unnatural stillness punctuated by the faint creak of floorboards, and the distant whisper of the wind outside, carrying no hint of the atrocities within. Each room unveiled layers of calculated cruelty, cooking implements repurposed for unspeakable tasks, hidden compartments storing what no human should be forced to handle, and ledgers cross-referenced with every master's preference, revealing a system so organized it defied imagination. Investigators, initially skeptical, now recoiled in a mix of horror and awe, their professional detachment crumbling as the magnitude of complicity became clear. The hero watched, heart pounding, as the estate's veneer of normalcy disintegrated, replaced by the raw, undeniable evidence of a nightmare made methodical. This was not just revelation. It was confrontation. Society, morality, and human endurance all staring unflinchingly into the abyss. The true faces behind the atrocities emerged like shadows in the dim light of revelation, each more unsettling than imagined. I want you to picture this. Men and women who had moved through society with ease, their charm, influence, and respectability masking unspeakable cruelty. As investigators cross-referenced the ledgers with personal accounts, the carefully maintained masks slipped, revealing calculated indifference, arrogance, and even glee in the orchestration of horrors. These were not monsters of legend. They were humans whose power, privilege, and position allowed them to manipulate fear into obedience. One by one, the 12 masters, previously unquestioned authorities, were confronted with evidence so damning that their composed facades fractured under scrutiny. Some feigned ignorance, their eyes darting for escape, while others, unable to hide the satisfaction in their meticulous planning, betrayed themselves in small gestures, twitching smiles, or the involuntary stiffening of posture. Now, you have to understand, the horror lay not only in the acts themselves, but in the calm, methodical way they had been executed, the sheer audacity of humans exploiting both secrecy and societal trust. Letters, personal journals, and corroborating testimonies painted each villain in vivid strokes, greed, sadism, and pride interwoven into the fabric of their daily lives. Even as law enforcement documented these revelations, the hero watched closely, knowing that the unmasking was as much psychological as it was legal. Each villain revealed the depths to which humanity could sink when morality is sacrificed for power, ambition, or convenience. And for the hero, this moment was a bitter triumph. Justice had begun to pierce the veil, but the true reckoning, for perpetrators and society alike, was far from over. As the investigation deepened, what initially appeared to be a localized horror began to reveal an unsettling web that stretched far beyond the Hampton estate. I want you to picture the hero poring over maps, letters, and coded correspondence, tracing connections that linked the 12 masters to merchants, plantation owners, and influential figures across the region, and even across the ocean. The scope of the crime was staggering, a network of complicity and secrecy that normalized exploitation and abuse under the guise of propriety. Now you have to understand, these weren't isolated acts of cruelty. They were meticulously coordinated, almost corporate in their efficiency, with each participant relying on a silent hierarchy of obedience and fear. Shipping manifests, trade records, and hidden ledgers suggested the horrific practices were replicated elsewhere, indicating that Lucy's ordeal, as unimaginable as it was, might have been one node in a larger, systemic pattern. Every connection uncovered brought a new layer of dread. Financiers, politicians, and respected citizens, unknowingly or willingly complicit, had turned a blind eye, or worse, actively facilitated the crimes. The hero, exhausted but relentless, followed each thread, piecing together a puzzle that exposed the moral decay of entire networks that preyed on vulnerability. Can you imagine realizing that what seemed like a singular atrocity was actually part of a shadowed system, thriving under layers of secrecy and societal ignorance? It was a revelation that reframed the narrative entirely. Lucy's suffering was not merely a tragic aberration, but a reflection of systemic corruption, an international network that treated human life as expendable, and a chilling reminder of how power can manipulate silence into complicity. Even as the web of villains and their international reach became undeniable, another, more insidious layer emerged: society itself. I want you to picture a world where whispers of the atrocities had circulated quietly among servants, neighbors, and minor officials, yet no one dared to speak openly. Fear, social hierarchy, and entrenched norms conspired to create a deafening silence. Let's be real, it wasn't only the 12 masters who allowed these horrors to persist, it was an entire community, an entire social order that turned away, rationalized, or outright ignored the truth. Newspapers offered careful euphemisms or suppressed reports entirely. Letters were destroyed, testimonies dismissed as gossip. The hero realized that the same mechanisms that protected the perpetrators were woven into the very fabric of society, ensuring that those with power remained untouchable and those without, silenced. This was a conspiracy not of grand meetings or sinister cabals, but of passive complicity. A collective agreement to prioritize comfort and reputation over morality. Now, you have to understand, the psychological toll of this silence was immense. Victims felt unseen, witnesses questioned their own sanity, and even the hero grappled with despair as truth clashed with public disbelief. Each revelation demanded courage to confront a society that had normalized suppression and secrecy, revealing that the real horror extended far beyond the estate's walls. In uncovering this conspiracy, the hero faced the uncomfortable reality that human cruelty is often sustained not only by direct action, but by willful ignorance, and that exposing it required relentless determination, courage, and the willingness to challenge deeply ingrained societal structures. With the veil lifted, the consequences finally began to ripple through every corner of the network. I want you to picture the 12 masters, once untouchable, now facing public outrage, legal scrutiny, and the quiet contempt of a society forced to reckon with its own complicity. Some attempted to flee, seeking refuge in distant estates or foreign ports, but the hero's meticulous documentation and the authorities' relentless pursuit left little room for escape. A few faced formal indictments, their lives dismantled in courtrooms where the evidence was undeniable, and each admission of guilt peeled back the carefully constructed facades of respectability. Others, however, were never fully held accountable. Wealth, influence, and the limits of jurisdiction provided a shield, leaving a bitter truth. Justice was uneven, often delayed, sometimes denied. And then there was Lucy. Though freed from her immediate torment, the psychological scars she carried were profound, a permanent testament to the trauma she had endured and the impossible moral choices forced upon her. The hero, who had risked everything to illuminate the truth, found no personal closure, only the haunting knowledge that exposing evil is rarely tidy, neat, or complete. Families fractured, reputations shattered, and the network's silent beneficiaries were forced finally to confront the consequences of their silence. Now, you have to understand, the fates of those involved were as complex as the crimes themselves. Punishment, survival, and lingering trauma intertwined. In this reckoning, the story of Lucy and those who enabled her suffering became a cautionary tale about power, complicity, and the human cost of turning a blind eye. As the dust settled, the story of Lucy of Hampton refused to fade quietly into history. I want you to picture this. The estate's walls, once silent witnesses to unspeakable acts, now standing as monuments to a past few dared to acknowledge. The legacy of these events was not merely the punishment of perpetrators or the exposure of complicity. It was a stark reflection of how power, fear, and societal silence can perpetuate unimaginable suffering. Let's be real. Lucy's ordeal challenges everything we think we know about morality and survival. Her actions, driven by coercion and desperation, force us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and the boundaries of ethical responsibility. The hero's painstaking investigation ensured that the narrative would endure, a record to educate and warn future generations. Historians, educators, and descendants of the community now carry the burden of remembering, of teaching, that silence and inaction can be as dangerous as cruelty itself. Now, you have to understand, the moral is layered and complex. It warns of the dangers inherent in unchecked authority, the complicity of society in the face of injustice, and the resilience of those forced to navigate impossible choices. This story reminds us that horror is often not the work of unknown monsters, but of ordinary people in positions of power, and that survival under oppression leaves both visible and invisible scars. Lucy's story endures as a chilling testament to the human cost of cruelty, the courage required to confront it, and the necessity of bearing witness, even when the truth is uncomfortable, painful, or almost impossible to face. As we close the chapter on Lucy of Hampton, I want you to pause and reflect on the haunting questions this story leaves behind. Could something like this happen again today? Would we even recognize it if it did? Now you have to understand, the horrors Lucy endured were not merely the product of isolated evil. They thrived because society, institutions, and individuals turned a blind eye. This is where the story gets truly chilling. Power can manipulate silence, and silence can perpetuate horror. I invite you, our bravest viewers, to not only bear witness, but to question, to speak, and to act whenever injustice hides behind the ordinary. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and join this ongoing investigation into the shadows of history. Subscribe to Echoes of Truth, because these stories demand attention, vigilance, and collective memory. And before we part tonight, here's a glimpse of what's next. A tale of whispers in the fog, of disappearances no one dared explain, and a mystery that has confounded authorities for decades. Can you handle what's coming? Because the next story will challenge everything you thought you knew about trust, deceit, and the darkness that lingers in plain sight. Stay close, stay curious, and remember, history has a way of repeating itself, but only if we let it remain hidden. Lucy's story may have ended, but the echoes of truth, the lessons of courage and vigilance, and the pursuit of justice continue, waiting for those willing to confront what others refuse to see.